The autumn sun was setting over the quiet streets of suburban Atlanta, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. The neighborhood basketball court still echoed with the sounds of bouncing balls and squeaking sneakers as players wrapped up their evening practice. Among them was a bright-eyed 16-year-old girl, her hair neatly pulled back in a ponytail, wearing her favorite purple basketball jersey with the number 23. She waved goodbye to her teammates, adjusting the sports bag on her shoulder. Practice had gone well. She'd finally mastered that three-point shot she'd been working on for weeks. Her mom would be proud. As she walked home, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about how she might make varsity this year if she kept improving at this rate. The street was peaceful, lined with maple trees that were just starting to show hints of fall colors. She could see her house from here, just 2 blocks away. The crossing was clear, and she had the right of way. She'd crossed this same street hundreds of times before, always careful to look both ways, just like her parents had taught her. But this crossing would be different. As she stepped onto the marked crosswalk, the sudden roar of an engine shattered the evening calm. A police cruiser appeared, accelerating through the intersection without warning or sirens. The officer behind the wheel hadn't even bothered to slow down at the stop sign. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the glint of sunlight on the cruiser's hood, heard the screech of tires on asphalt, and felt her heart jump into her throat. Her basketball bounced away as she tried to leap back, but it was too late. The impact sent her rolling across the hood of the patrol car, her world spinning in a blur of pain and confusion. When everything finally stopped moving, she found herself lying on the rough pavement, her legs screaming in pain. Through blurry vision, she could make out the figure of the police officer emerging from his car. But instead of rushing to help her, he was already speaking into his radio, calling for backup rather than an ambulance. Neighbors began appearing on their porches, drawn by the sound of the collision. Mrs. Chen from the corner house was already running toward them, phone in hand, dialing 911. I saw everything. She was shouting, her voice shaking with anger. That officer didn't even try to stop. The police officer, whose nameplate read something she couldn't quite make out through her tears, was now standing over her, his face a mask of practiced indifference. "You shouldn't have run into the street," he said loudly, clearly performing for the gathering crowd. But everyone had seen what really happened. The teenagers from the basketball court were already pulling out their phones, recording everything. As she lay there on the cold pavement, trying to stay conscious despite the pain shooting through her leg and head, she could hear more sirens approaching. She thought about her father, currently in session at the state capitol, and how he had always warned her about certain officers who saw not a person, but just a color. She had never expected to become living proof of his warnings. "Don't move, honey." Mrs. Chen was beside her now, holding her hand and glaring at the officer. "I've got your father's number in my phone from the neighborhood directory. He needs to know about this." The officer's expression flickered briefly. Was that concern? But he quickly masked it, returning to his stern demeanor as more patrol cars pulled up. Little did he know, his actions that evening would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the entire police department to its core. The girl lying on the pavement wasn't just another teenage victim of his prejudice. She was about to become the catalyst for changes that would reshape law enforcement in their city forever. The next few hours unfolded like a well-rehearsed play, with the officer leading a performance he'd seemingly directed many times before. As the young girl lay on the ground waiting for medical help, a small army of police vehicles descended on the quiet neighborhood street, their lights painting the growing shadows with alternating red and blue. "I need statements from everyone," the officer announced loudly, his voice carrying an authority that made several onlookers step back. But Mrs. Chen, still holding the girl's hand, wasn't intimidated. She watched as he pulled aside his arriving colleagues, speaking in hushed tones while gesturing at his patrol car's dark dashboard camera. "Funny how these cameras keep having problems," muttered one of the basketball players who'd stayed behind. He was still holding up his phone, recording everything. The officer noticed and turned sharply. "You need to step back," he commanded. "This is an active investigation area." Two other officers began dispersing the crowd, their practiced phrases designed to make everyone feel like they were helping by leaving. "Nothing more to see here," they repeated, despite the injured teenager still waiting for medical attention. The ambulance, mysteriously, was taking longer to arrive than the police backup. A young rookie officer, her face showing genuine concern, approached her superior. "Sir, shouldn't we get her statement first?" she asked, glancing at the girl. The commanding officer cut her off with a look. "We'll get all the statements we need once the scene is properly secured," he replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Meanwhile, the teenager's phone had skittered across the pavement in the impact. An officer picked it up, claiming it was evidence, despite Mrs. Chen's protests that it belonged to the girl. The phone disappeared into an evidence bag, along with any photos or videos it might have contained of the incident. The neighborhood watched from behind their curtains and doorways as the official story began taking shape. They could see the officers huddled around their patrol cars, writing in their notebooks, occasionally glancing at the girl still waiting for medical attention. The story they were crafting would later appear in their reports. A teenager, not paying attention, darted into traffic. The officer had no time to react. A tragic accident, but not the department's fault. But they hadn't counted on the neighbor's Ring doorbell cameras, or the security footage from the corner store, or the dozens of text messages already flying between witnesses. Most importantly, they hadn't counted on who the girl's father was, or the storm that was about to break over their heads. The ambulance finally arrived, its crew quickly assessing the girl's injuries. As they carefully lifted her onto the stretcher, Mrs. Chen spoke quietly to her. "Don't worry, sweetie. We all saw what happened. They're not going to get away with this." The girl managed a weak smile, fighting through her pain. One of the basketball players had slipped away during the commotion, rushing home to upload his video footage to multiple cloud storage locations. He'd seen how these things could disappear when only one copy existed. His hands shook as he typed out messages to local news stations, knowing this might be his only chance to make sure the truth got out. Back at the scene, the officer was now standing in front of a news crew that had somehow gotten wind of the incident. His practiced smile and calm demeanor painted a picture of professional control. "We're conducting a thorough investigation," he assured the reporter. But initial findings suggest this was simply an unfortunate accident. Behind him, the ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing but sirens silent. The officer didn't know it yet, but his carefully constructed narrative was already beginning to unravel. In less than an hour, the girl's father would receive the call that would turn this simple accident into a catalyst for change. The sun had fully set now, but the street remained lit by police lights and the glow of phones as residents quietly documented everything they saw. They knew from experience that in situations like this, the truth often needed more than one keeper to survive. The state capitol building stood tall and proud against the darkening sky, its golden dome catching the last rays of sunlight. Inside, the state senator was wrapping up a crucial budget meeting when his phone buzzed for the third time. He normally kept it on silent during sessions, but something made him glance down this time. His heart stopped when he saw Mrs. Chen's name and 5 missed calls. "I need to take this," he said, excusing himself from the round table of politicians. His colleagues nodded, used to emergency calls interrupting their discussions. But as he stepped into the marble hallway and heard Mrs. Chen's trembling voice, he knew this was different. This wasn't about legislation or constituent concerns. This was about his little girl. "She's at Atlanta Memorial," Mrs. Chen explained, her usually calm voice cracking. "A police officer. He didn't even try to stop." The senator's hands gripped the phone tighter as she described what she'd witnessed. 20 years in politics had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, but this was testing every ounce of his self-control. He was in his car within minutes, his driver navigating through evening traffic while he made calls. The hospital was 30 minutes away, but it felt like hours. His daughter, his basketball star, his Sunday morning pancake chef, his little girl who still kissed him on the cheek before school, was hurt, and he wasn't there. When he finally rushed through the emergency room doors, still wearing his suit from the legislative session, he found a scene that made his blood boil. 2 uniformed officers were stationed outside his daughter's room, attempting to look official while clearly trying to control who could visit her. "I'm her father," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of both parental authority and political power. The officers straightened up, suddenly recognizing him. Their faces shifted from routine intimidation to poorly masked concern. Inside the room, his daughter lay in the hospital bed, her leg elevated and wrapped in bandages. A nurse was checking her vitals while she dozed, likely from pain medication. The sight of her bruised face and bandaged head made his chest tighten. But it was the preliminary police report on her bedside table that made him pause. He picked up the report, reading it with the careful eye of someone who'd spent decades reviewing legislation. According to this document, his daughter had suddenly entered the roadway without warning and failed to utilize the proper crosswalk. Each line contradicted what Mrs. Chen and other witnesses had told him. The nurse, finishing her checks, touched his arm gently. "She's been asking for you," she said quietly. "She was worried you'd be mad about basketball practice running late." The simple comment, so normal, so everyday, nearly broke him. His daughter was lying here injured, and she was worried about being late. His phone buzzed again. A local news reporter he knew was texting him, asking for comment on the incident. Another message followed from his chief of staff, warning him that the police department was already preparing a press statement. They were moving fast, trying to control the narrative. Looking at his sleeping daughter, he thought about all the times he'd warned her about being careful around law enforcement. All the talks they'd had about being extra cautious, extra polite, extra everything, just to stay safe. He tried to protect her through education and awareness, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. A young resident doctor entered the room, carrying x-rays. "Senator," she said, her voice professional but kind, "your daughter has a concussion and a broken tibia. She's going to need surgery." She paused, then added more quietly, "We've documented everything thoroughly, including all the injuries, just in case you need it." The senator nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The hospital staff knew what was at stake here. They'd seen too many similar cases where evidence somehow disappeared. Outside the room, he could hear the officers talking in low voices, probably reporting his arrival to their superiors. Let them report, he thought. Let them scramble to cover this up. This time, they'd picked the wrong family to intimidate. This time, someone had the power to fight back. He sat down beside his daughter's bed, gently taking her hand. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. "Daddy's here now." And as he sat there, his mind was already mapping out the battle ahead. This wouldn't be fought just in courtrooms and press conferences. This would be a fight for justice that would shake the entire system. Dawn broke over the city as the senator made his first move. His daughter had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep, but his night had been anything but restful. His office had transformed into a command center, with his most trusted staff members working through the night, fueled by coffee and determination. "I've got something," his assistant called out, her computer screen glowing in the dim light. The convenience store owner just sent over his security footage. He was afraid it might accidentally get deleted. The video was crystal clear, showing the police cruiser accelerating through the stop sign, the impact, and everything that followed. The senator's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since midnight. Civil rights attorneys he'd worked with over the years offered their services. Journalists who trusted him as a reliable source were keeping their channels open, waiting for his signal. But he knew from experience that timing was everything. "Look at this," another staff member said, spreading out papers across the desk. We found 16 similar complaints against this officer in the past 3 years, all buried in the system. The pattern was clear. Young people of color, intimidation, excessive force. Each case had been dismissed or quietly settled, the officer's record somehow staying clean. Outside the hospital, reporters had begun gathering, but they weren't getting the story they expected. Instead of finding a frightened family hiding from attention, they discovered a coordinated response. Community leaders arrived with purpose, each carrying folders of documented incidents involving the same officer. Mrs. Chen had been busy too. Her neighborhood group chat had exploded overnight, with residents sharing videos and photos from their phones and security cameras. One clip showed the officer speaking to his colleagues, clearly trying to get his story straight before backup arrived. Another captured him refusing to call an ambulance immediately after the incident. The senator's legal team worked methodically, building a case that couldn't be ignored. They weren't just fighting for one injured teenager. They were exposing years of systematic protection of a dangerous officer. Every document was carefully copied and stored in multiple locations. They'd seen too many crucial pieces of evidence disappear in similar cases. Sir, his chief of staff entered with fresh news. The basketball court's cameras caught everything too. The facility manager saved the footage before anyone could request it be reviewed. They all knew what reviewed meant in these situations. Another convenient technical malfunction, another lost recording. The police department's internal affairs division wasn't used to this level of organized resistance. By mid-morning, they found themselves facing not just one incident, but a mountain of evidence showing a clear pattern. The usual tactics of delay and denial weren't going to work this time. Back at the hospital, the senator's daughter was awake and giving her statement to a trusted detective, one who had worked with her father on police reform bills. Her voice was steady as she recounted every detail, her years of being taught to stay calm in these situations showing through despite her pain. The shop owners want to speak out, another aide reported. They've seen this officer harassing young people for months. They were afraid to come forward before, but now, the senator nodded. He understood their fear and their courage in finally breaking silence. Local youth organizations began sharing their own stories online. A pattern emerged of the officer targeting young athletes walking home from practice, particularly in certain neighborhoods. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, making it harder for the department to claim this was an isolated incident. The senator watched the investigation unfold like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Each piece of evidence, each witness statement, each video clip worked together to tell the truth that had been hidden for so long. The officer's record couldn't hide behind badges and bureaucracy anymore. By afternoon, the police chief was calling an emergency press conference, but the senator had already declined their invitation to attend. He knew from decades in politics that the real work doesn't happen in front of cameras. It happens in quiet offices, in determined phone calls, in the brave voices of people finally ready to speak up. His daughter's nurse came in with medication, smiling at the sight of all the get-well cards already piling up. "The whole floor is talking about what you're doing," she whispered. "It's about time somebody stood up to them." The senator squeezed his daughter's hand gently. This wasn't just about justice for one person anymore. It was about changing a system that had protected the wrong people for far too long. The community's response started as a whisper and grew into a roar. It began with a simple text message chain. "Meet at the community center. Bring your stories." By sunset, the center's parking lot was overflowing with people holding handmade signs and carrying folders filled with documented encounters. A local teacher stood up first, her voice shaking but determined. "Last month, I watched that same officer follow my students home from drama practice. When I confronted him, he said he was maintaining neighborhood safety. Those kids were 12 years old." The room hummed with recognition. Too many people had similar stories. Outside, local news crews captured the growing crowd. But this wasn't the angry mob the police department might have hoped for. Instead, They found organized groups of citizens sharing documentation, comparing dates, and building a timeline of incidents. Parents brought their children's school records, proving they were good kids who'd been unfairly targeted. "Look at this," an elderly shop owner said, spreading out his daily logbook. He'd kept careful notes of every time the officer had parked outside his store, watching young customers and following them as they left. "I've been writing it all down for 2 years. I knew someday someone would need to know the truth." The senator's daughter watched it all unfold from her hospital room on the local news. Her father had taught her well. She understood that change happens when communities stand together. But she never expected to see her neighbors, teachers, and even strangers fighting so hard for justice because of what happened to her. A group of high school students had set up a social media command center in the community center's computer lab. They were collecting videos, screenshots, and stories, organizing them by date and location. Their tech-savvy approach was making it impossible for anyone to deny the pattern of harassment. "My grandson was stopped 3 times in 1 week," a grandmother spoke up during the community meeting. "He was just walking to his chess club." She held up his trophy from the state championships. This is who they're treating like a criminal. The police department tried to control the narrative, sending out press releases about their commitment to community safety. But they couldn't compete with hundreds of personal stories, each one documented and verified, each one showing how one officer's prejudice had affected countless lives. Local business owners began putting up signs in their windows. "Justice matters here." The message was simple but powerful. They weren't calling for violence or revenge. They were demanding accountability and change. At the hospital, nurses and doctors added their voices to the growing testimony. They spoke about other similar injuries they'd treated, about patients who were too afraid to report what really happened, about incident reports that somehow never made it into official records. The high school basketball team arrived at the community center wearing their jerseys, each carrying a stack of papers. "We've been keeping a group chat," their team captain explained. "Every time someone got stopped or followed, we wrote it down. We didn't know what to do with the information before, but now we do." Mrs. Chen had organized a group of neighborhood watch members. They'd compiled a map showing every incident they'd witnessed, complete with dates and times. The pattern was undeniable. Certain neighborhoods, certain times of day, certain types of young people being targeted. A retired police officer stepped forward, his badge number memorized by everyone in the room. He tried reporting his concerns about his former colleague through official channels for years. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," he said. "This isn't what protecting and serving looks like." The community center stayed open late into the night. People brought food, shared stories, and most importantly, shared hope. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about years of injustice finally being exposed to the light. Young children played in the corner while their parents documented their experiences. Some drew pictures of what they'd seen, their innocent artwork telling powerful stories about trust broken and fear instilled far too young. The senator received hourly updates about the gathering. Each message showed him the same thing. His community wasn't just angry, they were organized. They weren't just protesting, they were building a case that couldn't be ignored. And most importantly, they were showing his daughter that she wasn't alone. As night fell, candles appeared in windows across the neighborhood. Not in mourning, but in solidarity. The message was clear. The time for silence was over. The community had found its voice, and that voice would not be quieted until justice was served. The Internal Affairs Division wasn't used to working under the spotlight. Usually, their investigations happened behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny. But this time was different. As investigators walked into their office Monday morning, news vans were already parked outside, and their phones wouldn't stop ringing. "Have you seen this?" The lead investigator's desk was covered with printouts, emails, photos, and complaint forms dating back 3 years. Each piece of paper told the same story. An officer abusing his power, complaints being filed, and then Nothing. The paper trail always seemed to vanish into thin air. A young investigator, fresh to the department, couldn't hide her shock. These were all marked as resolved, she asked, flipping through the files. But there's no documentation of any investigation. Her supervisor remained silent, knowing this was just the tip of the iceberg. The police chief called an emergency meeting. The conference room was tense as Internal Affairs presented their preliminary findings. We've uncovered 17 previous complaints, the lead investigator explained. All involving young people of color. All mysteriously disappeared from our system. Outside, the media coverage was growing. Local news stations were running special reports, showing split-screen footage of the incident alongside interviews with past victims. The department's usual strategy of waiting for the story to blow over wasn't working this time. A clerk from the records department came forward, hands shaking as she handed over a USB drive. "I kept copies," she whispered. "Every time they told me to misfile a complaint, I saved it. I knew someday someone would ask the right questions." Her small act of rebellion was about to blow the case wide open. The young investigator spent hours going through the saved files. Each complaint showed a pattern. The same officer, the same aggressive behavior, the same dismissive responses from superiors. "Look at this," she called to her supervisor. "There's a note here about dashboard camera footage being accidentally deleted. Every single time." The state police had gotten involved now, sending their own investigators to review the case. They set up in a separate office, away from potential interference. Their presence sent a clear message. This investigation wouldn't be handled internally this time. The officer in question was placed on administrative leave, but that was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, they found connections between him and senior officers who had helped bury the complaints. The blue wall of silence was starting to crack. In the break room, veteran officers watched the news coverage with growing unease. They'd seen bad officers protected before, but this time felt different. The senator's influence, combined with the community's organized response, was shining a light into corners that had stayed dark for too long. A police psychologist reviewed the officers' mandatory evaluations. "These answers should have raised red flags years ago," she noted. "Who signed off on these?" More names were added to the investigation list. More questions needed answers. The young investigator worked late into the night, piecing together the timeline. "Sir," she called to her supervisor, "I think I found something." She discovered a pattern in the dates. Complaints disappeared right after certain officers worked the desk. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. State investigators interviewed dispatch operators, review board members, anyone who might have seen something over the years. Slowly, the full picture emerged. A system designed to protect its own, even when those actions put the public at risk. The police union representatives arrived, but their usual tactics fell flat. They couldn't claim this was an isolated incident, not with years of documented evidence proving otherwise. They couldn't discredit the witnesses when there were too many, from all walks of life, telling the same story. As the investigation expanded, more officers started talking. Some had witnessed incidents but stayed quiet, fearing retaliation. Others had tried to report problems but were told to remember who pays your salary. Now, with state oversight and public attention, they finally felt safe speaking up. By week's end, Internal Affairs had filled 3 whiteboards with their findings. Names, dates, incidents, and cover-ups. All connected with red string like something from a crime movie. But this wasn't fiction. This was years of systematic abuse finally being exposed. The young investigator sat at her desk, reviewing one last file before heading home. A photo fell out, the officer's police academy graduation. "He used to be one of the good ones," a veteran officer commented, passing by. The truth didn't emerge in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it leaked out piece by piece, like water through a cracking dam. It started with a morning shift dispatcher who couldn't sleep at night anymore. She had a copy of the radio calls from that evening, not just the official log, but the real conversations that happened before everyone knew who the girl's father was. "Listen to this," she told the investigators, playing the recording. The officer's voice was clear, casual even, as he called in before the incident. "Gonna check out some kids by the basketball court. You know how they get." The tone, the implication. It was all there. 20 minutes later, the same officer was calling for backup, his story already changing. The convenience store's security footage had been downloaded by the owner's tech-savvy grandson just minutes after the incident. Now it played on every local news channel. The police cruiser accelerating, no siren, no emergency. The officer hadn't even tried to brake. Social media exploded when a high school student posted their video. Shot from the basketball court, it showed everything in painful clarity. The girl in the crosswalk, the officer's deliberate acceleration, the impact that sent her flying. But it was what happened next that really caught people's attention. He didn't even check if she was breathing. One comment read, gathering thousands of likes. The video showed the officer immediately calling for backup instead of medical help, already working to control the scene rather than help the injured teenager. In the hospital, the senator's daughter was recovering, her room filled with cards and flowers from strangers. She watched the news coverage with mixed feelings. "I never wanted to be on TV," she told her father quietly. "But maybe this needed to happen. Maybe something good can come from this." The police department's spokesperson tried to maintain control of the narrative, but each press conference brought new questions. Reporters had gotten hold of the officer's previous complaint records. "How do 17 similar complaints just disappear?" they asked. The spokesperson's practiced smile started to crack. Local businesses began sharing their security footage too. Clips showed the same officer following young people, harassing them outside shops, conducting unnecessary, random checks. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. A retired police sergeant came forward with old emails he'd saved. "I reported him 3 times, he explained to Internal Affairs. 3 times I warned them he was targeting kids. They told me to mind my own business." His hands shook as he handed over the printed emails, but his voice was steady. The dam finally broke when the young rookie officer who had been at the scene decided to tell the truth. "He told us what to write in our reports," she admitted. "Said it was just procedure, that this is how we protect our own. But I became a cop to protect everyone, not just other cops." Her testimony opened the floodgates. Other officers, especially younger ones, started coming forward. They shared stories of being told to look the other way, of reports being lost, of warnings about staying quiet if they wanted to keep their jobs. The officer's own dashboard camera footage had supposedly malfunctioned, but a tech from the department couldn't stay silent anymore. "He asked me to wipe it," the tech revealed. "Not just this time. Any time he thought he might have been recorded doing something wrong." Public pressure mounted as more videos surfaced. A mother shared footage of the same officer harassing her son outside the library. A teacher had recorded him following students after school. Each new video added another crack to the officer's carefully constructed facade. The final piece came from an unexpected source. Another police cruiser, parked across the street during the incident, had its camera running. That officer, thinking about his own teenage daughter at home, couldn't live with the guilt. He turned over the footage, showing exactly what happened from a different angle. There was no more room for doubt, no space for alternative explanations. The truth was there in high definition. An officer of the law deliberately using his vehicle as a weapon against an innocent teenager, all because of the color of her skin. In her hospital room, the senator's daughter watched it all unfold on the news. Her leg would heal, the doctors said. The physical scars would fade. But she knew this moment was bigger than her injuries. This was about every kid who'd ever been harassed, every parent who'd ever worried, every community that had ever felt powerless against a broken system. "It's not just about me anymore, is it?" she asked her father. He shook his head, holding her hand. The truth had finally emerged, and with it came the responsibility to make sure this never happened to another child again. The wheels of justice began turning with unexpected speed. The senator had seen how the system usually worked: delays, excuses, quiet settlements behind closed doors. But this time was different. The evidence was too clear, the public attention too intense, and the momentum for change too strong to ignore. Inside the state capitol, a special session was called. The marble halls echoed with determined footsteps as legislators gathered to discuss police reform. The senator stood at the podium, his daughter's hospital bracelet still in his pocket as a reminder of why this mattered so much. "Today isn't about politics," he began, his voice carrying across the chamber. "It's about our children. About whether they can walk home from basketball practice without fear. About whether the badge means protection or threat." The usual partisan lines began to blur as stories from their own constituents poured in. The FBI's Civil Rights Division arrived without fanfare. Their agents set up in a local office, methodically going through decades of complaints. "This goes beyond one officer," the lead agent explained during a briefing. "We're looking at a pattern of protected behavior that spans years." In the police department, changes were already happening. The chief, seeing the writing on the wall, announced his early retirement. Internal Affairs, under new leadership, began reviewing every complaint from the past 5 years. Young officers who had reported misconduct were being called back, their concerns finally taken seriously. The senator's legal team worked around the clock. They weren't just building a case against one officer. They were documenting an entire system that had protected him. Every dismissed complaint, every lost piece of evidence, every witness who had been intimidated into silence became part of the larger story. Community meetings took on a new tone. Instead of just sharing anger and pain, people were proposing solutions. A retired judge helped draft new oversight policies. Teachers suggested programs to rebuild trust between police and young people. Even some veteran officers contributed ideas for reform. The hospital became an unexpected hub of activity. As the senator's daughter recovered, her room turned into an informal meeting space. Young people came to share their stories, community leaders brought proposals, and even some police officers visited to apologize and offer support for changes. "I want to become a lawyer," she told a local reporter who asked about her future plans. "Not just to fight against injustice, but to help write laws that prevent it in the first place." Her words inspired a scholarship fund for young people interested in law and public service. The officer was finally arrested, the handcuffs closing around his wrists with a click that seemed to echo across the city. But the senator knew this was just the beginning. "Arresting one person doesn't fix a broken system," he told his staff. "We need to make sure this never happens again." State lawmakers began drafting new legislation. Body cameras would no longer have convenient malfunctions. Complaint records couldn't be quietly buried. Officers with multiple accusations would face real investigations, not just transfers to different departments. The police union fought back, but their usual tactics fell flat. When they tried to claim this was an attack on all officers, good cops stepped forward to disagree. "Protecting bad officers doesn't protect the badge," one veteran surgeon told reporters. "It destroys everything that badge is supposed to stand for." In the community center, young people started a program to document police interactions through a secure app. Every stop, every questioning, every incident would be recorded and automatically uploaded to a public database. Transparency would no longer depend on broken cameras or misplaced reports. The senator's daughter returned to school on crutches, but she wasn't alone. Students formed a walking group, making sure everyone got home safely. Parents took turns monitoring police activity around school zones. The community had learned that safety came from standing together. Local businesses put up signs supporting police reform. Not angry messages, but hopeful ones. Building trust together, and community safety needs community input. Even some retired officers joined the movement, sharing their expertise on how to make meaningful changes. At night, the senator would sit with his daughter, looking through letters from other families affected by police misconduct. "It's like throwing a stone in a pond," she observed. "The ripples keep spreading." Her father nodded, knowing that real change happens not in single moments, but in thousands of small ripples combining into an unstoppable wave. 1 year later, the city looked different. Not in its buildings or streets, but in the way people moved through it. Young athletes walked home from practice without looking over their shoulders. Parents waited a little longer before calling to check on their kids. Small changes, but they meant everything. The officer had been sentenced last month. The judge's words still echoed in the courthouse. "The badge is a symbol of protection, not power. When we forget that, we betray everything it stands for." He received 15 years, with no possibility of early release. But more importantly, his case had triggered a wave of changes that reached far beyond one courtroom. The senator's daughter stood at the podium of her high school auditorium, her once broken leg now strong enough to carry her without a limp. "I didn't choose to become part of this story," she told the assembled students. "But we all get to choose what we do with the stories we're given." She had started a youth advocacy group that was already spreading to other schools. The police department had transformed. New leadership, new policies, new training programs, but the biggest change was in its culture. Officers who reported misconduct were now protected, not punished. Complaints were investigated thoroughly, not buried in paperwork. The blue wall of silence had given way to a culture of accountability. The community center hosted monthly meetings between police officers and local youth. Not formal presentations, but basketball games, cooking classes, real conversations. "It's harder to fear someone once you've burnt cookies together," the center's director liked to say. Those burnt cookies had done more for community relations than decades of official programs. That convenience store where it all started had become a symbol of change. Its owner had turned one wall into a community heroes board, featuring photos of people who stood up for what was right. The clerk who saved files, the rookie who told the truth, the teens who recorded evidence. Simple pictures that told a powerful story. The app developed by local students had gone statewide. Every police interaction was now documented, tracked, and publicly available. Officers knew they were being watched, but good cops welcomed the transparency. "If we're doing our jobs right," one veteran officer said, "we've got nothing to hide." In the state capitol, the senator's police reform bill had passed with bipartisan support. Real changes, independent oversight boards, mandatory body cameras with automatic uploads, a public database of officer complaints, protection for whistleblowers. But the law's most important impact was inspiring similar reforms across the country. Back at the basketball court where it all began, a new tradition had started. Every evening, young players and police officers shot hoops together. No uniforms, no badges, just people sharing a game and getting to know each other. Trust being rebuilt, one basket at a time. The retired officers who had supported the changes now trained new recruits. They shared real stories about what happens when power goes unchecked, when bias goes unchallenged. "Your strongest weapon isn't your gun," they taught. "It's your ability to see the humanity in every person you meet." The senator's daughter had just received her college acceptance letters. She was heading to law school with a full scholarship, but that wasn't the achievement she was most proud of. The youth advocacy group she started had spread to 50 schools across the state. Young people were learning they had a voice and how to use it. Mrs. Chen still kept watch from her porch, but now she waved to the police officers who patrolled the neighborhood. They knew her name, knew her famous tea and cookies. Simple connections, but they made the community feel whole again. The hospital had created a new patient advocacy program, ensuring that every incident involving law enforcement was properly documented. The young nurse who had helped the senator's daughter now led the program, turning pain into progress. On quiet evenings, father and daughter sometimes visited the spot where it happened. not to remember the pain, but to see how far things had come. New streetlights illuminated the crosswalk. A small garden bloomed nearby, planted by neighborhood kids. A place of fear had become a place of healing. As the sun set on another day in the changed city, the senator watched young people walking home freely, police officers greeting residents by name, community members looking out for each other. Sometimes, his daughter said, squeezing his hand, "It takes one moment of darkness to help us build something brighter."